I'm so excited to think about. So we've started the day with the national context, and now we're moving into the California context in specificity. We are the largest, the CSU in particular is the largest system in the nation, and we are also considering our other guests today, and thinking about our history. And as Dr. Perez mentioned earlier, we are the home and the beginning of ethnic studies. And so to take what Dr. McMillan Cottom has stated and put this in a California context, I am so thrilled to welcome Dean Anne Marie Todd to introduce the Ethnic Studies Collaborative at San Jose State University.
Thank you. I feel like it's the pandemic again. I'm worried about whether my Zoom background is backwards or not, but I'm just going to proceed. I'm extremely honored to be here among such an esteemed lineup of speakers. Dr. McMillan Cottom, wow. Whether it is her book Thick or her recent New York Times column about the racist responses to Beyonce's new country album, Dr. McMillan Cottom's work really pushes us to reflect on our own role in the national discourse. And thank you, Shonda, for asking us to be here. And not really me, but really the leaders of our ethnic studies programs at San Jose State to really help us reflect on this and within a national and the California context. So before I talk about a few words about our outstanding ethnic studies programs here, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Shonda Goward. Thank you so much for organizing this and putting it together. And thank you, Dr. Goward, in the 2.5 years that you have been here at San Jose State, you have pushed us to support all of our students and close equity gaps. You consistently ask the question, what about our students of color? How is this program supporting all of our students, including our students of color? And how can we do better by our students of color? And you ask these questions in the face of resistance, in the face of complacency, and you persist, continuing to challenge institutional racism and deficit thinking. And so thank you. It is my honor to be your colleague and really see the change that you are making in this world and at San Jose State. So I now have the honor of saying a few words about and in support of the outstanding ethnic studies programs at San Jose State. We have 4 ethnic studies programs, 2 departments, and 2 programs within another department. And each of these has a rich history. And as the dean, it's my job to be able to tell the story and not to speak for these programs, but to look at an overarching narrative that these programs bring in the rich history of San Jose State. So the Department of African American Studies was formed in 1969 with the first offerings of classes in fall of that year. And SJSU's AFAM, African American Studies Department, was one of the first 5 universities in the nation to implement the model for Black studies about 3 decades ago. The department's curriculum and programming and scholarship examines the intellectual traditions within the African diaspora from multiple perspectives, whether it's historical, cultural, philosophical, political, social, and theoretical, in service to its students and society. Created in 1968, the Department of Chicano Studies at San Jose State educates and serves students through interdisciplinary education based on principles of social justice. The department hosts the oldest graduate program in Chicano Studies in the United States, and one of only 5 graduate programs in Chicano Studies in California, and the only one north of Santa Barbara, California. The department's programming, curriculum, and research is grounded in interdisciplinary Chicano Studies tradition of pursuing carefully developed, culturally grounded solutions to community needs. The Asian American Studies program at San Jose State officially launched in fall 1970. When the proposal for a BA in Asian American Studies was submitted by students, faculty, and staff and was rejected, the group turned around and submitted a proposal for a minor degree instead, which was approved in spring 1970. 54 years later, the BA in Asian American Studies will launch in fall 2024 with majors coming in. Asian American Studies brings together interdisciplinary perspectives to address the long-standing inequities in education and research, and the field calls attention to the histories and contributions of Asian and Pacific Islander Americans and the important heterogeneity within these communities. The Native American Indigenous Studies program was established in fall 23 this year, hiring the first tenure-track faculty. The first 2 Native American and Indigenous Studies courses have been approved for offering in the coming fall 2024. Meanwhile, the Gathering of Academic Indigenous and Native Americans, or GAIN, which is SJSU's Indigenous and Native American faculty and staff affinity group, continues to seek to build community, promote visibility, and provide support for SJSU's Indigenous and Native American faculty and staff through campus activities and initiatives. The group published a report last year that outlined the barriers that Native American and Indigenous students face to build community and support. And the Native American Indigenous Student Success Center opened this semester. Each of these programs has its distinct history and contributions, some of which we may hear about in a little bit. In August 2018, the College of Social Sciences established the Ethnic Studies Collaborative that serves as the nexus for ethnic studies faculty, students, and community collaboration. The Ethnic Studies Collaborative took the lead in 2021 to launch Area F, which for those of you that are not in the CSU is the new CSU Ethnic Studies requirement mandated by California Assembly Bill 1460. These faculty developed a dozen new courses to be certified as general education to meet these requirements, scheduling those courses with instructors to serve 4,500 students a year. For any of you with experience in curriculum development, scheduling, et cetera, you could imagine the big lift that this was, and it was truly a collaborative effort. And I highlight this to demonstrate the ongoing work that faculty, staff, and students in our ethnic studies programs are doing to ensure that perspectives and disciplines of historically marginalized and underserved communities are represented, included, and supported and advocated for. In an essay on why ethnic studies matters, Natche Blue-Barnes, who is an associate professor and chair of ethnic studies at Oregon State University, says, ethnic studies asks us to engage the issues of racism, colonialism, global economic and political systems, ecological devastation, health degradation, cultural vitalities, and geographies of differentiation and discrimination. It asks us to look at our intersectionality. He continues, ethnic studies at its most basic asks us to think and to act, to ask and to listen, and to love and be responsible for. And I really like this kind of play on both what he calls the necessity of and right to anger and active resistance, but also joy and community building. And we can see this in the communities that come together in support of and because of our ethnic studies programs at San Jose State. It is about community empowerment. There's working affirmatively toward action. He also concludes, Blue-Barnes also concludes that none of the founding concerns, which I think we'll hear about today, have gone away. All of its founding concerns for community and health persist. When we think about ethnic studies, we think about an agent of change. And I have learned so much in the time that I've been here at San Jose State and the time that I've been here and in this role for less than a year, that really when we think about knowledge is power, we can learn from our ethnic studies program that is this commitment to social change. I'm honored that this work is happening in the College of Social Sciences. It reminds us to always remember that equity, diversity, justice, and inclusion are critical in all of our pedagogy, in our campus, and in our broader community. And I believe that the work that the ethnic studies programs are doing here at San Jose State, in the CSU, and across the nation remind us that we must center the stories of underserved, marginalized, and oppressed peoples and communities in our pedagogies and our community work in an ongoing pursuit of justice. Thank you, and I'm really excited about the panel discussion today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anne-Marie Todd. Welcome to the San Jose State Ethnic Studies program. Please take it away, Dr. Kerri Malloy.
Hello, my name is Kerri Malloy. I am the assistant professor in Native American Indigenous Studies here at San Jose State University and also the current director at the Ethnic Studies Collaborative. Today, you're going to hear from three of our programs: Native American Indigenous Studies, Asian American Studies, and Chicana Studies. And you notice that I left a very important one out. One of the things that has happened since the passage of AB 1460, which is the California State University Ethnic Studies mandate, is our work as faculty to deliver on that mandate has increased dramatically, which means we are all going full bore 100 miles a minute trying to meet that goal and trying to ensure that we're delivering the best possible experience for our students. And unfortunately, our colleagues in African Americans are not able to join us today because they are doing that important work, but that doesn't mean we don't recognize their work. We haven't ignored them. We've invited them. They just are committed to doing that work right now and are not able to be here. But you're going to see in the three presentations today that there's a common thread that connects back to the ability of education to help us aspire to move through the stratus of socioeconomics through knowledge. But that's also been used as a pushback by the majority, oftentimes, to say, you don't belong here. You are not part of this. you're going to see different cases in which, rather than race or ethnicity, we're going to be talking about political status. We're going to be talking about long-held prejudices against individuals. We're also going to talk about families that came together to push back and laid foundational work that led to desegregation throughout California and eventually the nation. As Dr. Goward said, is as California goes, so goes the nation. So as this ethnic studies mandate has rolled out throughout California and the rest of the nation, we're also seeing something that we need to be very cognizant of and aware of, is that as families and students begin to try to figure out how to make education more affordable, we see more and more high schoolers taking AP credits. And with the rollout from the College Board of the AP African American Studies course, that means students will be taking that general ed requirement earlier in their high school careers, not necessarily at the college level transferring in. We have to also begin to think about what that means for the future of ethnic studies. How do we build on that when a student comes in with having an ethnic studies course that counts for college credit in high school? How do we capture them again? How do we bring them in and help them develop that particular skill set going forward? Because that's an area that we have to do some work on. And we'll begin looking at that. But I'm thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Yvonne Kwan and Dr. Juan Pablo to discuss this with you. So I'm going to jump in here and start talking. I'm going to talk to you today about a case called Piper v. Big Pine. This is not the first desegregation case in California. In fact, you'll notice our panel is a little historically out of line, and that's okay, because we have to understand that all groups experience this similarly and differently. And I want to set the stage by talking about what the status of California is. And I'm going to use a term that some of you may or may not be familiar with, and it's called California Indian. In the larger aspect of Native America, the native population of California has a very specific designation. We are called California Indians. I am Yurok and Karuk. I am an enrolled member of the Yurok tribe, which is in Northern California along the Klamath River. That is a very specific designation that sort of separates us a little bit out from the rest of the country, because our legal status as Native people was very complicated. It wasn't like the rest of the nation, that as the United States moved across the continent, treaties were made, designations were made. California came into the Union after the Mexican-American War, and there were questions of what to do with these people. Were they citizens? Were they not citizens? How did they fit into the larger scheme? And those questions remained unresolved into the mid-1900s. So we have a very special designation called California Indian. So we're going to be talking specifically about the California Indian experience in education. Generally, when we talk about Native peoples and education, our minds go to the boarding school system, which was the federal system implemented by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Office of Indian Education that was designed to take Native children from their homes as young as 6 months old, take them to boarding schools where they were educated until the age of 18, and then return to their communities. That's generally what we think of. We think of that process of the Indian agent showing up at the home, taking the children. Most of those children did not return home until they were adults. They were trained. If you were a young man, you were trained in blacksmithing, you were trained in agriculture. If you were a woman, you were trained in housekeeping and home economics. You were trained how to do all the things necessary to maintain a home, as well as reading, writing, some math. My great-grandmother was a student at Sherman Indian School, which is now Sherman Indian High School in Riverside. All of her brothers and sisters went to boarding school. That is the general idea of what we have. In California, there were 3 boarding schools that operated. Many of the children from Northern California were sent south to Riverside. Many of the Native children that had grown up and their families were in the South were shipped off to the North, and some as far away as Chemawa, Oregon. So and a lot of that was to break down those tribal connections, those family bonds with each other, and also to keep children from running away and going home, that was always successful. But there's another type of school that also existed. These were called the Indian day schools, and these get very little recognition in our larger conversation. These were federally run grammar schools that were primarily based on reservations. If you were a California Indian and you lived on a reservation, you would automatically go to the Indian day school. The Indian day schools were underfunded. Many of them were just sort of abandoned. The government just said, we're not going to run them. This left a lot of young Native people without an educational system. But we're going to look at Alice Piper's case. Alice Piper is a Owens Valley Paiute, and she was born in 1908. And she had started to attend the Big Pine Indian Day School. That's where her education was going. And then her family decided to leave the reservation, well, there wasn't a reservation, leave the Indian community and move out of that area. They'd originally started their life near Manzanar, which we generally associate with one of the Japanese internment camps during World War II. In her time there, she learned reading, writing, and arithmetic. But when her family moved, they decided there was only a public school, a general California public school that they wanted to go to. And she was denied the ability to go. Her and 5 of their children were brought together. And, like most cases, there was a decision that had to be made. It's like, who's going to be the face of this? And they chose Alice not for any other reasons than as you read the transcripts of the case and you look at this, it was because of how she looked. She was pretty. She was well kept. She didn't have any quote unquote filthy habits. So she made the perfect face for the case. They lived far enough away from the Indian Day School that it would have been an hour-and-a-half trek both ways for her to go. So the decision was to try to enroll her in this public school. And she was denied entrance. And she was denied because the courts in California had always upheld this concept of separate but equal, and that Native students couldn't be allowed in there because there was a secondary system. Under the California Education Code at the time, if there was a Native school, then the public school system could deny access to Native students, and they could go there. When they bring this case, they argue something very different. They don't argue an issue of race. They begin to argue an issue of political status. And for many of you, this is going to be new information. Native people in the United States exist in a strange duality. We are not only just citizens of the United States, citizens of our state, citizens of our county, citizens of our cities. We also have a secondary citizenship, and that is with our tribes. Our tribal nations, our federally recognized tribes, bestow on us a concept of political status that is separate from our status as U.S. citizens. In California at this time, there were very, very few federally recognized tribes, primarily because of the way in which California came into the Union. The Bureau of Indian Affairs and the U.S. Congress didn't know what to do with California Indians. They hadn't set up a real reservation system yet. They had passed something known as the 4 Reservation Acts, where they just sort of picked land, and those were for 4 different tribes. The rest were primarily unrecognized. They would not have any political status. They wouldn't have that dual political identity. And the attorneys in this case made a really different argument, and that was, under the California Constitution, citizens were mandated to be able to get education. And the court had to sit down and think really about what this meant. And the case was filed in August of 1923. And I keep that date in mind. Keep 1923 in mind at this point, because it's as important. It's a very important thing as we get to the end. The argument at the time was because Alice Piper's family had left their Indian community, that they had accepted US citizenship, that they had accepted California citizenship because they no longer resided within their Indian community, and therefore didn't have the political status of being an Indian. That's sort of a very strange argument to make, because that's not necessarily how we talk about desegregation. We talk about desegregation based on our race and ethnicity. In this particular instance, the argument was made that since the family had left their Indian community, they had given up their Indian identity, and therefore were subject to the laws of the United States. The court has to do some wrangling with this. They have to really think about this. And in the decision, they walk through this, about 3 paragraphs of time spent to determine, was Alice Piper a citizen of the United States? And they go back as far as the General Allotment Act, the Dawes Act, which was used to break up native reservations around the country. And in that act, it says, if you don't reside within your reservation boundaries, or you don't reside with an Indian community, you are therefore then a US citizen. And you have given up that connection to your people, that individual political status that comes with being a tribal member or enrolled citizen of a tribe. The court walks through this and says, look, they are no longer holding this political status. They have not ceased to be racially or ethnically native. They've exterminated their political status. That is no longer there. And at that point, they go through the Constitution and the California Education Code, and they say, because they are citizens, they are therefore entitled to a public education in the California system. And the court issues a unanimous ruling on June 2nd, 1924. And that's a significant date, because earlier that day in Washington, D.C., the United States Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act, which extended citizenship to all Native people in the United States, regardless of whether they existed with their Indian community, on a reservation. And it has an interesting provision that says, regardless if you've moved away or not, you are still considered a tribal, having that political status as a tribal citizen. So what would have, I mean, these two things happen at the same time. And it opens up California's school system to Native people. And eventually they move on. And I go back to this because my grandmother was born in 1921. She was not a US citizen at the time. She becomes a citizen under the Act of 1924. She went to Indian day schools, her and my grandfather both, actually. What does that mean for them? That now they can actually go into the public school system. It means they can get a high school education, which as far as they both went at the time. But it means that their children can go on, and one of their youngest daughter, my mother, goes on to get her bachelor's degree and eventually her teaching credential to teach in the California school system. And all 3 of her children have gone on to college and a little bit beyond. But that sets up a larger precedent, is it opens up the door for Native people to begin to move through the formal education system that hasn't been designed to eliminate their language, their culture, their connection to their people. It opens a way for Native people to begin to express themselves in the academy in a way that hasn't happened before, particularly in this state. That doesn't mean everything's all well and good. We see cases throughout the state right now of tribes and Indian communities coming together, looking at elementary and high school districts and saying, look, we're seeing a disproportionate rate of our children being subject to disciplinary action, to expulsion. You have the ACLU, particularly in Delaware County, which is an extreme northern part of the state, pushing back and working directly with tribes and school districts to address these issues. These are things we're seeing throughout the state. We're also seeing a pushback on Native children who are graduating from being able to wear their traditional regalia or components of that at their graduation as a signification of who they are and their own identity. We've recently seen laws passed that address that prevent that. But what does that mean? That desegregation didn't end the prejudices and misconceptions that exist there. We're still fighting this battle on multiple fronts, smaller fronts, but very significant fronts that we're having to address. So as we think about the impact of what desegregation means, we also have to understand it's not the great solver of the problem. We are still wrestling with those today. And how do we move through that? How do we work together and look across all of our interests and say, what is the commonality that we can come together on and push forward? Thank you very much. And I'll turn this over to Dr. Kwan.
Thank you so much to Dr. Goward, our webinar guests, and also my fellow panelists, Dr. Malloy, Dr. Mercado, and Dean Todd for sharing the space of reflection and learning today. So my name is Yvonne Kwan. I'm an associate professor of Asian American Studies at San Jose State. I also serve on the statewide CSU Council on Ethnic Studies and chair the CSU-wide Asian American Studies Caucus. Today, I'm going to discuss Tape v. Hurley, one of the most important civil rights decisions that happened right here in California. I know our chat isn't open, but I bet if it were, and I asked how many of you have heard of it, probably not that many. So why is this the case? I mean, the things that happened in California were actually leaps and bounds before things that happened on the federal level, right? So Dr. Malloy talked a little bit about that earlier as well. Kerri, can you forward, please? There we go. So the parents of American-born Mamie Tape successfully challenged a principal's refusal to enroll their daughter and the children of Chinese heritage into Spring Valley Primary School, just up the road, at least from us here in San Jose. It was in San Francisco. This was 7 decades before the landmark U.S. Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board. So Joseph Tape, as you'll see, he's on the left of this photo here, was a well-regarded businessman. And he was a transport agent and a bond broker. So he for sure was not one of those poor Chinese laborers that we would see of that time on political cartoons who were stealing all the jobs, right? So he was a merchant of the merchant class. He and his wife, Mary, had 3 children. All were born in the United States during a time in which anti-Chinese sentiments and violence was at an all-time high. White workers blamed Chinese laborers for suppressing wages and for their economic hardships. This, however, would overlook the culpability of the white colonizer industry leaders who replicated those exact exploitative capitalist practices. Here in California in particular, we saw this with Leland Stanford. You know, there's a big university just up the road from us, Stanford University. However, Leland Stanford was one of those who were part of the big industry leaders leading the railroads and all of that. And they were the one who set the wages and used the Chinese as poor laborers because the Chinese had very little ability to actually resist, right? Because of language barriers and the such. However, time and again, the Chinese actually would come together and strike. And so one of the earliest practices of striking was also led by Chinese laborers. So anyhow, I digress. So you can see examples of this anti-Chinese sentiment. Next slide, please. Through images such as the one on your screen here. If you take a quick look at it, there's a progression of a monkey that essentially becomes one of the Chinese workers, right? And the Chinese workers, you can see, could have that queue, that braid and that pigtail, okay? And they're also akin to pigs, right? And the Chinese would also be depicted often as rats and other vermin as well in these types of political cartoons. Also, in 1854, there was a court case of People versus Hall. Chinese were determined to be a race of people whose nature was marked so inferior and were incapable of progress and intellectual development. Ergo, they would be unable to testify in the court system. Even if somebody of Chinese descent were murdered in cold blood out in the street and everyone saw, a Chinese person could not testify in court for that person. So you can see that there's setting these precedents already of this anti-Chinese sentiment. June of 1866, the Humboldt Register would note that the Chinese were on their way out to Montana when they were attacked, and around 40 were reportedly killed. This was amongst many of the other massacres that also happened to the Chinese people. 1882 would come the big one. This is the federal legislation of the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was the first mass exclusion of Chinese immigrants based on national origin. They were also determined to be inadmissible aliens, ineligible for citizenship. So there was no way someone of Chinese descent, and later on by extension, any Asian descent, who could become a naturalized American citizen. So on the heels of this, in fall 1884, we have 8-year-old Mamie, who was denied admissions to the local school. Principal Jenny Hurley refused to admit her, despite there was a law in 1880 that entitled all children in the state to public education. Forward the slide, please. Hurley cited that San Francisco School Board policy was admitting, please forward the slide, was admitting a child of Chinese descent, including, sorry, slide, please. Thank you. All right, so let me try this again. So Principal Jenny Hurley at Spring Valley Elementary refused to admit Mamie because her mother, Mary, walked her to the school and said, I want to enroll her in classes here. So the principal said that San Francisco School Board policy states that we cannot admit a child of Chinese descent, including those who were born in California, because Mamie was born in California. So the tapes sued the San Francisco School Board of Education and the Spring Valley School principal, Jenny Hurley. And the decision would come out January 9th, 1885. Please forward. Superior Court Judge McGuire decided in favor of Mamie, writing, quote, to deny a child born of Chinese parents in the state entrance to the public schools would be a violation of the law of the state and the Constitution of the United States, end quote. However, the same year as the court's decision in 1885, the California State Assembly enacted Bill 268 to establish separate schools for children of quote unquote Mongolian or Chinese descent. And those schools were thus established. Many children would not be admitted into other schools. And this came well before Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. So on April 8th, 1885, Mary Tape again walked Mamie over to Spring Valley and again spoke to the principal. This time, the school said that, oh, Mamie has no certificate of vaccination and that all our classes are already at capacity. So ergo, refuting that actual case or going against the decision from the case. Therefore, Mary wrote a detailed letter of protest to the Board of Education. Next slide, please. To the Board of Education, dear sirs, I see that you are going to make all sorts of excuses to keep my child out of the public schools. Will you please tell me Is it a disgrace to be born Chinese? Didn't God make us all? What right have you to bar my children out of the school because she is of Chinese descent? So you can see how livid, how indignant Mary was. So although Mamie Tape never actually enrolled in or attended Spring Valley, the Chinese children who came afterward would increasingly begin attending more white schools in San Francisco. So in the back of this image here, you can see kind of in the background, that was actually the Chinese school. It was built after that Bill 268 in California to create schools, those separate but equal schools in California. And that is where Mamie and her brother actually ended up attending. So when that school opened up, her mother walked the kids there. And even though later on in this letter, she would say that I will never take my children to this kind of school because it is a second-class school. You created it in an inequitable way. The thing is that Mary knew the importance of education and that she would not bar her children from that, even if the school was not the same as the ones attended by the white children. Ultimately, that Bill 268 would be repealed in 1947, 7 years before the US Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board that school segregation was unconstitutional. All right. One last note here to end is that the Chinese often use the court system to secure their rights. And one key example includes a notable case of the US versus Wong Kim Ark in 1898. This would come to establish birthright citizenship, wherein anyone born on US soil is a US citizen with no regard to race, class, or gender. So any of us who is not of the quote unquote Caucasoid European descent race are only American citizens in the United States of America because of a person of Chinese descent in 1898, fought in the courts for that. So in sum, while California is often touted as a beacon of liberal political alignments, our state was built on a foundation of structural racism, right? Of settler colonialism and dispossession. However, Asian Americans and other marginalized peoples have worked so hard to fight together, sometimes through the court system, sometimes militantly, for these basic rights. Fast forward into the 1960s, and you'll find that Asian Americans, along with other BIPOC folks, fought for the right to not only equitable, but also liberatory education. They fought for ethnic studies. And you'll see some of the images here on the screen. On the top right is the Chinese for Affirmative Action that was founded in 1969, primarily by women. And you'll see that the person that is holding up the magazine there, her name is Connie Young Yu. She's also one of my community collaborators. If you see in the photo on the bottom right, that was last year at a unity protest against the Supreme Court decisions around affirmative action and also the suppression of queer rights. And Connie is actually in that picture right next to the sign that says education for all. So you can see that we have the OGs, right, that have been fighting this fight for a really long time and still are very much committed. And also you'll see in the program cover there on kind of the middle, the blue image, this is the 2020 Southeast Asian American Studies Conference that was hosted by San Jose State. I was the conference convener. And it highlighted the particular needs of our refugee communities, particularly Southeast Asian American refugees. And as we see in the times of today, I expect that the issues of refugee relocation, resettlement, and all of that from challenges of war and genocide will be upon our heels very soon. Asian Americans are often used as a wedge in the racial paradigm. But as many of my colleagues have posited, is it justice or just us? We refuse to be used as a pawn, as a monolithic model minority, and with such stereotypes that are ahistorical and overlooks the critiques of such divisive practices. Moreover, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders are often lumped into one group. But We hope that with the new disaggregation of racial data through the OMB and the census, that we can come to better understand and advocate for the diverse needs of our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, because we are not all the same. We have different historical experiences and also different current contemporary challenges as well. But yet we will work together across and within our groups and across the different racial groups to fight for a more equitable and just society moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Appreciate having the opportunity to speak on such a distinguished panel. And like was mentioned earlier, I've just been learning so much. So really excited about this opportunity to share a few ideas with you all. Kerri, if you can move to the next slide real quick. Just before I start, I wanted just to kind of offer a few references for some of the remarks that I'm talking about, some of the work that I'm building off of and sharing with you all today. Kind of like Dr. Cottom sort of mentioned earlier, which I think most of us are sort of bookheads in here. This allowed me to kind of do a deeper dive into a topic that I was familiar with, but really kind of unearth some things that maybe I wasn't sort of familiar with in the past. But, you know, building off of the work of people like Mark Brilliant, Albert Camarillo for sure, Philippa Strum, was really important for organizing my thoughts here. So yeah, I just want to share that. Kerri, if you can switch to the next slide. Thanks. So the Mendez case casts a very complicated yet very important legacy, not just in the history of California, but also in the broader fight to challenge segregation and discrimination in this country. And I see the broader fight to challenge segregation because, according to historian Kerri McWilliams, there were at least a dozen Southern California communities that were embroiled in school desegregation battles in the 1940s. Of course, the most precedent-setting of these was the Mendez versus Westminster School District case, which pitted 4 Orange County school districts against approximately 5,000 students. In 1947, the Mendez, the Guzman, the Palomino, the Estrada, and the Ramirez families won the legal battles in a U.S. federal court to end racial segregation in public schools. I also say the broader fight to challenge segregation and discrimination because although the students in the Mendez case were all Latinos and Latinas and overwhelmingly Mexican American, the organizations that filed amicus briefs on their behalf, the NAACP, the Japanese American Citizens League, in conjunction with the ACLU and the American Jewish Congress, all lent Mendez a sort of multiracial coalition dimension that was very helpful in moving this forward. And maybe we can sort of talk about, you know, if indeed sort of that fizzles out over this period, but maybe that's a discussion for another day. If you can go to the next slide, Kerri. Now, this story initially includes 2 families who made Southern California their home during World War II. Approximately 125,000 Japanese Americans were forced to evacuate their homes into incarceration camps. 70% of the Japanese Americans were born U.S. citizens. Among those incarcerated was a Monimitsu family. They left everything behind and they had to lease their family farm to the Mendez family with the hopes that one day they would be able to come back. The Mendez family made the farm their new home, moving from Santa Ana to Westminster. When they tried to enroll their children into the local school, they were denied admission because their Mexican-American children, weren't deemed acceptable, and they were forced to go to Mexican schools. Now, the manner in which American citizens of Japanese descent were dehumanized by the government of the United States really underscores the central relationship between race and civil rights. Japanese Americans were, quote, evacuated from their homes, they were stripped of their property, and unjustly denied their lawful citizenship rights because of ultimately unfounded racial and political anxieties. This had 2 major repercussions for the agricultural sector. First, the removing of Japanese farm families, and second, the displacing of Japanese field workers who contributed significantly to the agricultural industry. As the Japanese were abruptly removed and forced into internment camps all throughout the Southwest, the farm labor shortage intensified. You can go to the next slide, please. Now, in a highly paradoxical twist of fate, this incarceration and internment actually opened up the door for thousands and eventually millions of Mexican farm workers in the form of the Bracero program, which sought to address the temporary labor shortage of World War II. And this would last for over 2 decades and reflected explicit notions of racial inferiority that were commonplace to the US labor force. Because Mexican workers did not have the same labor rights as American workers, it became more and more evident that the Bracero program was part of a larger process of racialization and coercive working conditions taking place in the United States. Now, I say paradoxical for 2 reasons. First, during the Great Depression, there was a highly coordinated yet highly illegal scheme to forcefully deport the Spanish-speaking population of the United States. During this period, many white Americans began to rearticulate their relationship with Mexicans. They felt these folks were taking jobs from American citizens who were unemployed. They felt that Mexicans were disproportionately on welfare rolls, creating a drain on limited relief funds, and that Mexicans were in the United States illegally and should not benefit from public services. I know when I share this line with my students, I feel like I'm repeating a 2024 campaign platform, right, of contemporary times. American officials concluded that deporting all Spanish-speaking peoples, regardless of their citizenship status, would be a solution to this, quote, Mexican problem. Shortly thereafter, a massive deportation campaign started to brand Mexicans as scapegoats for the ills of the Great Depression and sought to expel all Mexican and American citizens of Mexican descent. Now, I just want to underscore that you have a massive campaign to forcefully deport Mexican Americans in the early 1930s due to precarious economic and labor conditions in the country. And then less than a decade later, you have a massive effort to recruit Mexican workers back into the United States because of seemingly precarious economic and labor conditions. Now, I also say paradoxical because of the blatant injustice experienced by one family of color in California, here we're talking about the Monomitsu, it actually resulted in the opportunity for other families of color in California to advocate for a more just society and contribute to the broader multiracial challenge to segregation in this country. The next slide, please. Now, it's important to note in this case that the onus was not necessarily to prove segregation, but rather to prove discrimination. Since both sides had sort of agreed that legally Mexican Americans were considered white under the law, although sort of we know, right, they are treated as an ethnic underclass. In part, the strategy of the legal team trying the Mendez case was to show that the separate but equal doctrine, in fact, did violate the 14th Amendment, in that separate schools were indeed not equal. The legal team had to do 2 very explicit things. First was to demonstrate that school districts in that area were colluding together to discriminate against Mexican American children by not allowing them to attend white schools. And secondly, that this discrimination had an irreparable harm on the children by providing inadequate and, in most cases, inferior educational resources to the students. The defense team had to counter the separate but equal doctrine by providing testimony that showed overwhelmingly that segregation did not make sense as it led to discrimination. Attorney David Marcus presented social science evidence to support his argument that segregation resulted in feelings of inferiority among Mexican American children that could undermine their ability to be productive Americans. The experts showed that, in fact, what was happening was that this sense of inferiority was going to interfere with the ability of Mexican American children to learn. Now, Judge McCormick eventually ruled in favor of Mendez, noting in his decision that, and I'm quoting here, the equal protection of the laws pertaining to the public school system in California is not provided by furnishing in separate schools the same technical facilities, textbooks, and of course, and courses of instruction to children of Mexican ancestry that are available to other public school children, regardless of their ancestry. A paramount requisite in the American system of public education is social equality. It must be open to all children by unified school association, regardless of lineage, end quote. His decision is upheld after appeal, yet it's only the Westminster School District that integrated Mexican children. And though the Mendez decision legally ended segregation in California's public schools, it did not affect de facto segregation. As the Mexican-American population increased rapidly during the post-war decades, and as barrios expanded, the number of Mexican-American children in ethnically isolated neighborhoods rose dramatically. By 1970, there were actually more Mexican-American, nearly 2/3 of all the school-age children in California, in segregated schools than in 1947, when the Mendez decision was rendered, right? So, although we have a legal redress, it did not truly solve de facto segregation. Next slide, please. Now, in part, what we're here to do is to commemorate the anniversary of this critically important moment in the history of the United States. And when I think of the multiple ways in which we remember the modern civil rights movement, I'm drawn to the words of noted civil rights historian Jacqueline Dowd Hall and her formative essay on the long civil rights movement and the political uses of the past. In that essay, she stresses that remembrance is always a way of forgetting. And the dominant narrative of the civil rights movement often distorts and suppresses as much as it actually reveals. Here's precisely where I'd like to sort of spend the last slide or two of my talk, talking about the uses and function of public art. Now, I teach at San Jose State University, obviously, and lived in this part of Northern California for a significant period of my life. San Jose has an extremely rich history of public art that helps to shape the collective memory of the city. As I find myself walking through the campus and the downtown, I become more and more inspired by the public manifestations of public art motivated by the current and the historical movements for social and racial justice present in this nation. Sites of public memory have always had a significant impact on how we understand and oftentimes misunderstand this country, its history, and our place within that history. It also seems that the radical artistic renaissance that chronicles these historical moments are rooted in a seemingly basic yet extremely profound ethos. By transforming public sites into spaces of knowledge production, collective reflection, and democratic advocacy, the opportunity for public art to liberate really becomes limitless. Now, by imagining public art as an innovative process that crosses the boundaries of social justice, history, and collective memory, we can employ a form of remembering that speaks to the struggles of our communities while also creating the possibilities to transform history. Now, what I mean by this is that by reimagining certain flashpoints in US history through the historical projects of public art, we demand a more nuanced consideration of the past that dislodges narratives of discrimination and racial violence. What also results from this reconsideration is a construction of multiple histories that can challenge universally accepted, yet often distorted legacies of this nation. The various murals in and around downtown San Jose during the summer of 2020, commemorating George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and the countless number of people of color that have been murdered by a legal and an extra-legal regime of white supremacy and intolerance all underscore not the aberration, but rather the status quo of United States history. This nation was founded on a premise of violent land disposition, environmental degradation, segregation, of course, and racialized violence and murder. Choosing to commemorate those who have been casualties in the wake of this manifest destiny is a form of rejecting that foundational premise and imagining something else, something better, something more just. Next slide, please. In 2009, Justice Eileen Moore formed a partnership between the California Court of Appeals 4th District and the Orange County Department of Education to commission a mural. Together, they created a program that empowers students to create art based on issues tackled within the Orange County courts throughout the years. The Mendez versus Westminster mural was painted by students of the Orange County Department of Education's Alternative Community and Correctional Schools and Services program at the Otto A. Fisher School. The school serves incarcerated youth within the Orange County Juvenile Hall. The 6 juvenile hall artists that did this mural, Andrew K., Kaylee F., Jose C., Abraham V., Stacy Lynn R., and Juan G., created the 8-foot by 6-foot mural in 2009. It was unveiled as a centerpiece of the courthouse. Now, public art provides a very important opportunity to choose what we will collectively remember. For so long, we as a nation chose to revel in a history of militarism, of segregation, and that of white supremacy. What we as a nation have an opportunity to do now is to reject those previous and outmoded and incomplete histories and envision stories of resistance, of struggle, and of love. Public muralism and public art projects reimagines a more democratic historical consciousness, in this case, visually representing a set of histories that focus on the possibilities of racial equality and humanistic solidarity at the same time as it is exposing the limits of a violent and authoritarian regime hell-bent on exacerbating the subjugation of its own peoples. Realizing the multiple uses of public art is an effort to construct public memory and to struggle against coercive ideas of subjugation and exploitation. These public art projects and these murals provide a vision of what this country could and should look like. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the San Jose State Ethnic Studies programs, Drs. Malloy, Kwan, and Mercado. This was just, I'm still taking it all in. I'm so glad we're recording this so that we can follow up and share out some of these clips, because I knew some of this history, but not this deeply at all. And your contributions are incredible. Please come off camera. We have enabled the Q&A for the audience members. I am sure you've got some questions for these incredible faculty about what they've shared. While you all are putting your questions in the Q&A form, I'm going to kick off with, we wanted the specific histories to be shared. And now that we have that understanding, how do we resist together? Professor Kwan, you started around this, and it's not just one individual group. How do we do this resistance work together?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the key things, at least here for San Jose State Ethnic Studies, is that we have worked across differences. I'll first talk about more the academic kind of level, and then a larger kind of perspective of this, right? So I'm actually going to have the shameless plug here. Oh, there you go.
There we go.
I had this on one of my slides, but this is the new special issue of AAPI Nexus, which is Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders Policy, Practice, and Community. I was actually a co-editor on here, and it actually brought together our colleagues across the CSUs, some from the UCs, and also K through 12 practitioners to discuss what does it take to actually get policy passed that will help us secure those rights, secure those resources and opportunities for our students of whichever background, but in particular, those who have had marginalized backgrounds, access to education like ethnic studies, so that we can better learn about these histories, and so that can inform the ways in which we advocate in the present, right? And then beyond that as well, I think it's actually working within our communities, right? So one of the nice things that, the cool things that I've been able to do is that I work very closely with our local community leaders and learning from them is that they had to work together in the past across differences, right? And we cannot stay in our particular silos. Like, yes, we have our individual needs, but these conversations need to happen across not just the disciplines, but across our different communities, so that we can see, okay, what are some kind of creative ways in which we can leverage strengths and address some others kind of like gaps to push together, right? And then also, it's not always like kumbaya, like everyone is happy about things either. There's lots of tensions within this, and that's why it's not going to be something that we just appear into the community. And sometimes there is pushback, and sometimes there are kind of difficult conversations that have to happen in order for this work to be fruitful. But it's something that we have to take on, because the alternative options are much worse, I think, for our communities if we fall into those wedges and don't work together.
Thank you so much. And I hope the audience can forgive me for sucking on a cough drop. I am not well, but I'm doing my best. Juan Pablo or Kerri, Dr. Malloy, and Professor Mercado, your thoughts on how do we do this work together? How do you add to what Dr. Kwan is saying?
I think the biggest way to work together is realizing we're all headed towards the same goal. And, I think we tend to think that the passage of AB 1460 and its implementation, while huge and a great step forward for ethnic studies and helping us all to start to work together, it also put us at odds with each other, because there's a small amount of money that has to do a whole lot of stuff. And so we do have to work together and realize that the priorities for one group may not be the same as for another. And we have to sort of figure that out. And, I hate to say it like this, but the best way to keep people from not moving forward is to let them argue over money. So we have to, that's sort of why the Ethnic Studies Collaborative is so important, is we're working together to figure out how best to deploy these funds. How do we do that? But the other component is also understanding our interrelatedness. The Mendez case came about primarily because of what occurred to Japanese Americans in California. We're all related. Watching the presentation, I took a step back because I am married into the Ramirez family that is part of the Mendez case. Lorenzo Ramirez, who helped run the Becerra program, was one of the individuals, and we just buried the last of the brothers who testified in that case. We are all connected in this. And a lot of times we tend to get tunnel vision in our very specific disciplines and not realize there's a large crossover in how we can work together to put this forward. And I think that's the biggest thing, is we got to just remember the goal has always been to keep us apart. We got to come together.
I'm so glad you mentioned the money, because at the end of that impacts so much. Dr. Mercado, did you want to add?
I would just say briefly that just like Dr. Malloy said, we sort of need to remind ourselves that we are this is a shared history, right? I'm sort of reminded of Dr. Cottom's sort of early words this morning. Black civil rights is human rights. So the struggle that one group is advocating for really is in the service of all marginalized and subjugated folks. And we have to sort of continue to remind ourselves of that, especially when times get tough.
Absolutely. So we've got a comment, and then there's a question that sort of relates to that comment. Someone said, I love this so much. I'm hoping to integrate this type of education into my social work program. Our mission statement is a focus on social justice, but we are not taught our colonial histories. How do I, as a student, advocate for integration of these ethnic studies histories into my social work program? If we don't know our histories, we won't know how to move forward. How does a student advocate?
I think there's a couple ways you can do it. And please, I never said this, so just delete this part of the recording. Is you have to do evaluations of your professors at the end of the semester. Write it in there. Great class, didn't include the colonial history. Do that. Advocate to your academic senate. Why isn't this being taught? Those are the more formal ways, but the ones, do it yourself. You have access to a library, you have access to professors. Start incorporating that ethnic studies component and those colonial histories into the exact work you're doing, and show that it can be done. Because sometimes, you know, we are professors, we get tunnel vision, and we don't necessarily think about other things when we're aiming for our own deadlines and trying to keep a class on track. Is sometimes it takes a student paper who doesn't go, oh, I could actually be doing this, and, you know, inspire your faculty.
I would also like to add that, you know, since you're a student of social work, you can also take classes outside of your program, right? There are plenty of opportunities. I don't know which level you are. If you're at the undergraduate level, our general education programs for not just ethnic studies, but women, gender, sexuality studies on many of our campuses across the CSUs, and some more developed than others. But come take a class with us, or minor even, or double major, because I was a double major as an undergrad. And so I'll say, okay, so graduate level social work, but you could still, you know, audit those classes if professors are interested in that. And I know auditing is like, oh my gosh, that's a lot of work. But come and have conversations, open office hours. Like Kerri said, we don't bite. Sometimes we don't know what our students need. And you might not be able to find it in your social work program, right? And because we are all just because somebody perhaps studies race or ethnicity doesn't make them an ethnic studies practitioner or scholar. So it's important to also kind of diversify your outreach and just having conversations with various faculty.
And sometimes you can talk to your department about getting a class to count. So maybe there's a professor teaching an ethnic studies class that is an undergraduate level. Maybe you can talk with that faculty member about doing an independent study that will work it towards graduate and have your department count it towards your program. One thing I did in my doctoral program was have someone outside of my discipline on my committee. So that's another way to incorporate some of this into your work. So some of it is really on the individual student. Dr. Mercado, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you didn't. I just agree with both of my colleagues there. I would say for the instance of like Chicano and Chicana studies, there is a clear overlap with social work. We have a really good relationship with the education department. So there's a lot of ways, right? And there's a lot of history and knowledge, right? And methods that can be used and learned in multiple subjects. So yeah, I think that's a great idea. Go outside your bounds, right? Sometimes we have the silos on, right? And so it's important to spread out.
And then Sabri Stacy says hello to Dr. Malloy from Humboldt, and that students can bring this stuff up in class. It's okay to say it in class. This is how you get those participation points. Another question was, when you all share this colonial history and you discuss the history of oppression, particularly in California, what are your students most surprised by?
Can I jump in there on that one?
Please.
You know, last in the fall, this last semester, I taught a course on folk life and culture, and it focused on public art and muralism. And so students, of course, they're surprised, but I took it as an opportunity to walk them through as best I could, right? Thousands of years of sort of history, right? Indigenous history up to contemporary times, but through artwork. And I sort of remind them that the history and the stories are there. They're in front of us, right? They're embedded in the ground, right? They are there in that cultural production. But part of what we need to do is figure out how to sort of receive that message, right? So working with them to sort of figure out, to understand, you know, the murals that they're seeing, the artwork, the songs that they're listening to. So it's the response for me is great in that sort of collaboratively working together to figure out how to sort of receive these type of messages. I always tell my students that as a young person growing up in Sacramento, I would often see these murals of these revolutionaries on the walls, right? And not quite knowing the history, but understanding that they were important for some reason, right? And in a way that history was being embedded into me through this cultural production. So working with them to sort of figure out how do we actually understand and make sense, right, of that history that's around us.
I think the most students tend to be more surprised that we are and not were. If we think about how we talk about, particularly around Native people, it's always in the past tense. It's never in the present. And so the idea that there's a real Indian standing in front of my classroom sort of shocks them. I mean, it's a shocker for them. And then
I
to
don't mean to
get them,
laugh, but it's the way you said it so plainly.
oh,
Like,
yeah,
wow. Yeah.
it's a shocker, and especially, and particularly when then they have to begin to realize that there are Native people all around them and in all aspects of life. And it comes as a huge shock. And then they begin to ask a bigger question. Why didn't they know this before? And then you have to begin to go back and say, look, basically, if you remember your high school history books, sorry to traumatize anybody with that, but in 1849, Native people just disappear. They pop back up somewhere in the civil rights movement, and then they're gone again. So it really for them is a shock. It just doesn't register in their brain until you start talking in the present. And it takes a good 15 weeks to get them to change their language, because they're been so indoctrinated to, Native people belong in the past. We're not supposed to be here today.
And I will add on is a similar thing is that why am I just learning about it now? That's the main question that I usually get for students. And they're like, in our textbooks growing up, maybe you'll see one paragraph on the railroads, the Chinese building the railroads, and then another paragraph on Japanese incarceration during World War II, and then perhaps one tangential paragraph about the Vietnam War, right? And so it's like three ways in which it pops up, but all within the lens of capitalism, right? Nativism and war, and then again, like nativism and war, but never are the actual people involved in that, right? So how do we put faces, feelings, stories, narratives to these larger historical contexts?
That's so important. I can think of my my city is trying to do that work in our little town. So one way folks, if they're thinking about how do they do this work if they're not an ethnic studies professor, is push your own city, push your own town to memorialize, to talk to folks, to have those oral histories recorded. It's making a big difference in Hayward, and I'm proud of us for doing that. Someone asked, so they're giving y'all the dropping the weight on y'all this morning. What is your advice to colleagues who work with faculty with an ethnic studies equivalency who don't believe that ethnic studies demands action? Y'all not even gonna let
That
them
they're
get their
wrong.
coffee yet.
I mean, the basic principle that is ethnic studies does demand action. If we look at the entire history of ethnic studies, it is about action. And when you say, not you, but your colleagues, when they're saying that it doesn't demand action, it's not an equivalency. It is a history course at best. You have to do the action. That's why we're doing this. There's no other motivation than to make things better.
And so just to clarify, ethnic studies is not about identity politics. It's not just about representation, right? The field in and of itself was born from protest, from militant protest as well, right? So, and there is that liberatory piece of it built into the epistemology and even the pedagogy of ethnic studies itself. So someone getting a stamp saying that it's an ethnic studies equivalency versus it actually having or being an ethnic studies class can be very different.
Oh, that's deep.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say like this notion of accountability, right? Just like I just finished up a section in my history course on the Chicano and Chicana movement, and we're talking about the development of student groups at Plan de Santa Barbara, and the development of Mecha on college campuses, right? Student-led organizations to hold the administration accountable, right? We need instructors, right, that are properly trained. We need the culturally relevant curriculum, right? We need administrators that reflect our backgrounds, right? So holding the campus accountable, right? For this type of education, yeah, is important.
Absolutely. So some folks said, thank you so much. They are queer Chicanx. They find themselves being the only one to bring up these concepts of decolonial approaches, which can be isolating at times and discouraging. They're hoping to see in the future a decolonial approach to clinical therapy and social work and just across the board everywhere. Thank you for being here and for sharing your perspective. Pamela James says they would love to receive recommended readings. They are full-blooded Native American, relocation baby Chickasaw, Santee Sioux, and Menominee. They are the BIPOC director of the South for their CCA, Community College Association Union, and they thank you for this time this morning. This is greater than I even imagined when I talked to Dean Todd and she put me in touch with Dr. Malloy. I'm so grateful for you all's perspectives and one, what you all are talking about in the specificity of ethnic studies and what that means. I think that was really important today, talking about how we can work together to continue this decolonial work. And then also understanding that this work has a long history in our state. California is not immune to this, is really important. So thank you, Dr. Malloy, Dr. Kwan, Dr. Mercado, and the Ethnic Studies Collaborative.